Good evening, welcome, and this is our second episode, season 1 of Conclave. I'm Sudeep Sen from New Delhi. It's 9:40 at night, and my co-host.
Yeah, I'm Fiona Sampson. We haven't got that bit quite smooth yet. We haven't been doing this on the breakfast sofa for long enough, and it's 4:10 in the afternoon in rural Herefordshire in England.
And Dawn is in Washington, D.C. Dawn does the technicals. So we will start this evening with Arthur Sze, followed by Marilar, and then Sean O'Brien. And Arthur and Marilar will be introduced by Fiona, and Sean O'Brien will be introduced by me. Everyone has 15 minutes to read. After each reader, the hosts just intervene and ask maybe a question or a comment. And when the entire thing is done, we have a proper discussion amongst the host and the readers themselves. So welcome, Arthur. And please use the chat box, as I've said, generously. I'll be putting all the information up there, and share your books information and links and so on and so forth. Welcome, Arthur.
Welcome, Arthur, and welcome, Marilar, Aleixandre, and welcome, Sean O'Brien. So this afternoon we're going to talk about, or really you're going to talk about, poetry and politics. And we've tried to be really capacious with all our topics so that we have, a range of wonderful poets whose work speaks to each other across cultures as well as across geographies. Elective affinities is definitely our watchword. And some of our guests in the series know each other. Some of them know guests from other episodes. All of them are friends of ours and much admired colleagues in one way or another. Some of us haven't met in the room for over 10 years. Some of us have met really recently. So I hope that what's going to happen this afternoon, I'm sure this is Sudeep's hope too, is that gradually some just very loose sense of the potentialities of poetry for moving in and out of the political sphere, moving in and out of questions about identity, culture building, cultural belonging, culture making are going to wax and wane. It's a great privilege to introduce Arthur, whose wonderful new and collected poems is just coming out. I hope you can see it there. I hope I'm aligning it all well enough with the camera, from Copper Canyon, The Glass Constellation, and a wonderful title for a wonderful book, and an incredibly apt title too. Arthur, I'm going to embarrass you by reading your bio note. So Arthur, as we probably all know, is a poet, translator, and editor. He's the author of 11 books of poetry, including The Glass Constellation, new and collected, Sightlines 2019, which received the National Book Award, Compass Rose 2014, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, Ginkgo Light 2009, selected of the Penn Southwest Book Award, and Mountains and Plains Independent Booksellers Association Book Award, Quipu, the Redshifting Web, selected for the Balcone Poetry Prize and the Asian American Literary Award, and Archipelago 1995, selected for an American Book Award. He's also published a book of Chinese poetry translations, The Silk Dragon, in 2001, which was selected for the Western States Book Award. And he edited Chinese Writers on Writing in 2010. Thank you, Sudeep. I love having, we should all pull everything off our bookshelves. It's fantastic. A recipient of the Jackson Poetry Prize from Poets and Writers, a Lannan Literary Award, a Guggenheim, a Lila Wallace Readers Digest Writers Award, 2 National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowships. Sze was the first poet laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico. From 2012 to 2017, he was Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, and in 2017 elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His poems have been translated into over a dozen languages, including Chinese, Dutch, German, Korean, and Spanish. He's Professor Emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts. I believe that Sean and Arthur, well, I'm sure they will tell you this themselves, met through the agency of Yang Lian, our guest last time in China. And Arthur and I also met through the agency of Yang Lian. So many thanks to Yang Lian, who's in a sense a co-host for this episode too. Arthur, it's a huge privilege and pleasure to have you here. And I know we're really going to enjoy this reading. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fiona, Sudeep, and Don for making this reading, international reading, possible. It's such a pleasure and honor to be reading with Sean and Marilar. It's 9:15 in the morning in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so we're at all hours of the day, afternoon, and evening. I think I'm going to read 6 poems, and in terms of how they fit with poetry and politics, I want to let the poems speak for themselves. In a few instances, I'm going to set a little context for them, but I'm just going to go ahead and read. This first poem is called First Snow. A rabbit has stopped on the gravel driveway. Imbibing the silence, you stare at spruce needles. There's no sound of a leaf blower, no sign of a black bear. A few weeks ago, a buck scraped his rack against an aspen trunk. A carpenter scribed a plank along a curved stone wall. You only spot the rabbit's ears and tail. When it moves, you locate it against speckled gravel. But when it stops, it blends in again. The world of being is like this gravel. You think you own a car, a house, this blue zigzagged shirt, but you just borrow these things. Yesterday, you constructed an aqueduct of dreams and stood at Gibraltar, but you possess nothing. Snow melts into a pool of clear water, and in this stillness, starlight behind daylight, wherever you gaze.
Beautiful, beautiful.
This next poem is set in China, a China that you wouldn't recognize today. It's really China in the mid-1980s after the Cultural Revolution, and it's called The Negative. A man hauling coal in the street is stilled forever. Inside a temple, instead of light, a slow shudder lets the darkness in. I see a rat turn a corner running from a man with a chair trying to smash it. See people sleeping at midnight in a Wuhan street on bamboo beds. A dead pig floating, bloated on water. I see a photograph of a son smiling who 2 years ago fell off a cliff, and his photograph is in each room of the apartment. I meet a woman who had smallpox as a child, was abandoned by her mother, but who lived, now has 2 daughters, a son-in-law. They live in 3 rooms and watch a color television. I see a man in blue work clothes whose father was a peasant, who joined the Communist Party early, but by the time of the Cultural Revolution had risen in rank and become a target of the Red Guards. I see a woman who tried to kill herself with an acupuncture needle, but instead hit a vital point and cured her chronic asthma. A Chinese poet argues that the fundamental difference between East and West is that in the East, an individual does not believe himself in control of his fate, but yields to it. As a negative reverses light and dark, these words are prose accounts of personal tragedy becoming metaphor, an emulsion of silver salts sensitive to light. Laughter in the underground bomb shelter converted into a movie theater. Lovers in the summer palace park. This next poem moves more apropos to America. It's called Black Center. Green tips of tulips are rising out of the earth. You don't flense a whale or fire at beer cans in an arroyo, but catch the budding tips of pear branches and wonder what it's like to live along a purling edge of spring. Jefferson once tried to assemble a mastodon skeleton on the White House floor, but with pieces missing, failed to sequence the bones. When the last speaker of a language dies, a hue vanishes from the spectrum of visible light. Last night you sped past revolving and flashing red, blue, and white lights along the road, a wildfire in the dark. Though no one you knew was taken in the midnight ambulance, an arrow struck a bullseye and quivered in its shaft. 1 minute gratitude rises like water from an underground lake. Another, dissolution gnaws from a black center. This next poem is said in Hawaii, actually, on the Big Island along the Kona coast. And it's called Cloud Forest. And there's one line, because this is an international reading, I'm just going to make a little notation. There's one line, we find these truths to be self-evident, which is a riff off of the Founding Fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Cloud Forest. Against the mountain slope, incoming fog. We stood near the maroon strips of bark and inhaled the aroma of a rainbow eucalyptus. In the Netherlands, a rising sea level is stressing dikes, and a kepa is singing. Waves were white-capping against black lava rock. On an atoll, nuclear waste was dumped into a concrete vault. We find these truths to be self-evident. In a past life, I played the clarinet in a marching band. Now the vault has cracked. Have we not meandered, bewildered in a cloud forest? Along this coast, you are tracing the contours of desire. The pilot veers the helicopter up over the canyon rim as we gasp. The Maui has vanished. We step into red ginger daylight.
Stunning, stunning, beautiful.
This next poem is a change of pace, is called Lichen Song, and it's written from the point of view of a little piece of lichen stuck up in a ceiling board when a person steps out of the shower, and the lichen speaks to the human being. Lichen Song. Snow in the air. You've seen a crust on the ceiling wood and never considered how I gather moisture when you step out of the shower. You don't care that I respire as you breathe. For years, you've washed your face, gazed in the mirror, shaved, combed your hair, rushed out, while I, who may grow an inch in 1,000 years, catch the tingling sunlight. You don't understand how I can dive to a temperature of liquefied gas and warm back up, absorb water, start growing again without a scar. I can float numb in space, be hit with cosmic rays, then return to Earth and warm out of my sleep to respire again without a hiccup. You come and go while I stay gripped to pine. And the sugar of existence runs through you, runs through me. You sliver if you just go, go, go. If you slowed, you could discover mosquitoes bat their wings 600 times a second, and before they mate, synchronize their wings. You could feel how they flicker with desire. I am flinging your words, and if you absorb, not blot my song, you could learn you are not alone in pain and grief, though you've instilled pain and grief. You can urge the dare and thrill of bliss if and when you stop to look at a rock, at a fence post, but you cough, only look. Yes, look at me now, because you are blink about to leave. And this last poem is called Sightlines. It's set in northern New Mexico, about 20 miles north of Santa Fe, here where I live. And in this valley, there are a lot of irrigation ditches. We're off one river. There are ditches that channel water and feed irrigation fields. And to the west, if you're walking in this valley, up on a mesa, on a flat top, you can see Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atom bomb. And this last poem will move through space and time. It's written in one-line stanzas, so there's silence between the lines. And it's a form I invented. Each line picks up a word or words from the previous line, and that includes the title, Sightlines. I'm walking in sight of the Rio Nambe. Salt cedar rises through silt in an irrigation ditch. The snowpack in the Sangre de Cristos has already dwindled before spring. At least no fires erupt in the conifers above Los Alamos. The plutonium waste has been hauled to an underground site. The man who built plutonium triggers breeds horses now. No one could anticipate this distance from Monticello. Jefferson despised newspapers, but no one thing takes us out of ourselves. During the Cultural Revolution, a boy saw his mother shot in front of a firing squad. A woman detonates when a spam text triggers bombs strapped to her body. When I come to an upright circular steel lid, I step out of the ditch. I step out of the ditch, but step deeper into myself. I arrive at a space that no longer needs autumn or spring. I find ginseng where there is no ginseng, my talisman of desire. Though you are visiting Paris, you are here at my fingertips. Though I step back into the ditch, no whitening cloud dispels this world's mystery. The ditch ran before the year of the Louisiana Purchase. I'm walking on silt, glimpsing horses in the field, fielding the shapes of our bodies in white sand. Though parallel lines touch in the infinite is here. Thank you.
Bravo. That was really, really stunning, Arthur. Thank you. One of the things I just want to say quickly, this is the book I first had. This was my introduction to your poetry. This was a while back, of course, probably in the 90s, I think.
Yes.
Now you have this sort of huge compendium that's coming out, which I'm looking forward to seeing. You know, whenever I read your poems on the page, of course, your poems are very, very lyrical, very exact. The phraseology is really pitch perfect and sharp. But when I read them on the page, I know you're lyrical as a poet, but I use a different kind of music, and I hear a different kind of music when I read the poems. What is surprising and unsurprising is the fact that when you read them, you'll sound like an American poet reading poetry, it's a bit of an odd thing, because the musicality that is embedded in your poetry is quite in contrast to the American cadence of reading. I was wondering whether you could say something quickly about that.
Yeah, I think, well, at least for a while, American poets had a tendency to, when they read their poems, to sort of go up at the end of a line. There was kind of like
Yes.
a rise and fall. And I felt like, I don't know where that came from, but I felt like that really wasn't letting the language, the musicality of the language come from within. It was more like an expectation, or it became a kind of style that was very popular at readings. And I felt over time, I mean, I've tried my own sort of reading voice has changed, but I think at this stage I'm more relaxed and I'm more interested in letting the sort of textures of sound in each word in English. And maybe because, you know, I grew up speaking Chinese first in New York City and then learned English, that my handling of English is a little different than a lot of American poets. But, you know, so I find I'm most interested in allowing the sort of sound and rhythm of the words to come out from inside and to maybe slow the pace down. And I also like to have a lot more sort of silence between the phrases, because my poems tend to be very rich with imagery. And if I read them too quickly or read them in a kind of narrative that a lot of maybe American poets do, they get too compressed or jumbled up or pushed next to each other. And I feel like my poems need a slower pace, a little more breathing room, and a little more attention to silence.
Thank you.
That's such a fascinating thing to say. Thank you. And such a wonderful reading. I mean, and I suppose I'm thinking the same thing as Sudeep, but in a slightly different way, which is that I felt it listening to you, but I also feel it when I'm reading you, although I agree with Sudeep, the music is different for me as a reader. It's the wrong word, stealthy is the wrong word, but there's a sense of, apparently there's just tremendous stillness and lucidity, but my goodness, suddenly there are these depth charges, and you do this tremendous conceptual and particularly in these poems, very political work, but you bring it in as if nothing has moved, but actually you've brought in all this material. And doing that, you kind of show us that experience, or the world, or isness, is kind of geological like that. It's simultaneous, and there's this stillness, but actually, my goodness, there's so much weight underneath the still water on the top. That's mixed metaphors all over the place, but you know what I mean.
Well, thank you. No, that's a huge compliment. Thank you.
I mean, it's very overt in a poem like Lichen, where you join up the motion and you show the conceptual motion, but a lot of the time you make a statement and then you make the statement that lies under that, and then you state the underlying thing, and then you state the underlying thing. It is extraordinarily powerful and cumulative.
I think that the sort of juxtaposition between lightness and density is remarkable, because it's light at one level and it's beautifully calibrated and weighted, but the phrases and what you're trying to convey is, you know, it's like this volcanic mass. You know, it's full of ionic particles, so to speak. Yes.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. That was beautiful. Thank you. We'll come back again.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Marilar is our next poet, and Sudeep is just about to put up your biographical note, Marilar. It's a huge pleasure and honor to introduce Marilar Aleixandre, the Galician poet and writer. Marilar and I met in Santiago de Compostela in 2009, something like that. And we met really for a very short time, but Marilar made such an impression on me, both her writing and her thinking about Galician culture making, and then poetry and women's writing in general, that I've just remained full of admiration, and we stayed in touch. And I'm going to read your bio note, Marilar, but it's always very difficult, I think, talking about the political importance of a woman writer, because that can, if you're not careful, be reductive, and I don't see why it should be reductive, but writing as a woman should not be a political act, and yet it seems to me that it is, and that you could write practically anything as a woman and that would still be a political act in today's overwhelmingly gendered literary world. Marilar, I'm going to introduce you by reading your bio note now. Marilar Aleixandre learned to write from drafting tracts for underground journals. She claims to have a forked tongue. Such are the risks of licking blood from knives, but she needed it in order to write in Galician. And actually, I grew up in Wales, where we also say, which is a bilingual country, English and Welsh, and we say that the dragon, which is the Welsh symbol, speaks with a forked tongue. So from these split identities, she does research about critical thinking in the University of Santiago de Compostela. She also writes poetry and has been granted a number of awards for A Catalogue of Poisons or Shiftings, a rewriting of Ovid's Metamorphoses in Women's Voices. Her fiction includes her last novel, Bad Women, 2021, set in a women's prison in the 19th century. And her fiction for young people, Hedra Medusa, which was published by Small Stations Press, deals with the social violence and ostracization that follows rape. It's a very shocking and very lucid piece of fiction. Her work has been collected in English anthologies, The Wind in Our Sails, Migrant Shores, and Bregen's Lighthouse, which, although I can't pronounce it, I have on my bookshelf. Sometimes, she says, one of her several voices gets stuck in her throat, like the bones of fishes that Galician people eat, head, tail, and all. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you, Marilar. Thank you for joining us.
Well, first, thank you, Fiona and Sudeep, for making this possible. I'm going to read first from my book, A Catalogue of Poisons, and it was my first volume. And when I gave it to my father, he said that my mother used to write poems, but afterwards she was tearing them up. This book is about tensions between the women and mothers. So, derrotas domésticas. Debe ser muy difícil degolar las anguías sen cortar los dedos, arrandearte para que non te cubrisen as escamas do llomor, liscar do no corredío das sabas, nas noites opacas, que batallas contra os garabanzos medrando disformes na aula, que absurda tarefa escoller lentellas de arroz, que impotencia cando o leite fervido vai por fora inevitablemente. E se o batefondo das tisolas non che deixaba oír a música, se o teu francés e alemán eran inútiles contra a grasa nos fogóns, se os tubos de auga berran como nenos ou gaivotas e as patacas se pegan no fondo da tarteira, nai, como é que estás sorrindo nas fotos? From the same volume.
Marilar, I'm just going to pause you there a moment, because I am not sure whether that poem was among the translations that you sent to Don, was it?
No, it's the first one. Domestic defeats.
I'm looking at Don. I'm giving Don eye contact just to.
No.
Yes.
No, this is Fernando Carrera. It's a different document.
Right.
What you're showing.
Here we go. Keep going down.
Okay. Do you want me to send it
You
again?
think it's in there?
Don, maybe
I
if you
apologize. Let's look through and see if this is correct.
Okay. No, No, this is not me. This is
No, it's a different poet.
Margarita Villarreal is another poet.
Yes.
Ah,
Keep going
Right.
down, Don, in case that Jennifer has just put it all in one document rather.
Okay, so
we have violin en silencio, silent violin.
no, this is not mine.
No.
Sorry, my mistake then, or Jennifer's.
Do you want me to send it again?
That
The
would be
document?
great.
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Marilar.
Okay, excuse me. I will get
Of
a
course.
moment into. Should I send it to?
Okay, do you have Don in the group email? Because Don is the...
Oh, I have here Sudeep and Fiona.
Then send to us and we'll send straight to Don.
And
Marilar,
Don Krieger. Okay, Don Krieger, I have it here.
so you can just reply to that one. I actually saw that it didn't look, it didn't quite register with me that it wasn't you. I didn't quite understand the document though.
Do you have it?
Not
Did you
yet.
just send it? Give us a shout when you sent it, Marilar.
Here it is.
Oh, great.
Okay,
It'll take-
only that in the document there is first the poem in Galician and then in English.
Yes.
So, I
It'll
don't
take,
know.
it always takes a moment to open it.
Well, as I was saying, you know, the problems of having forked tongues
Yes.
are apparent when you are
Exactly what I was thinking. Yes.
so.
Yes. And I just wanted to add a small note, which is that, you know, Head of Medusa is published by Small Stations Press, which is in Bulgaria, and
Yeah.
it's the press of Jonathan Dunn and Sveta Elenkova. And Sveta Elenkova is reading in our series in May, June. And Jonathan is a translator both from Bulgarian and from Galician. Very interesting combination. Is this it?
Yeah, this is me. Yeah. Excellent. So perhaps I will skip the next because we have less time.
No, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite, Marilar. I think that you should probably...
Well, okay.
I'm
So
almost tempted to say you should read from the beginning again because, you know, it's a shame you didn't have the translation. But certainly from the second poem, please don't feel you should go short.
Yes,
Okay,
this one comment, this doesn't look like Spanish like the other one did.
no, it's Galician.
Exactly.
It's very similar, but so domestic defeats. Then.
Lovely, thank you.
Debe ser muy difícil degolar las anguías en cortar los dedos, arrandearte para que non te cubrisen as escamas do llomón, liscar do no corredío das sabas, nas noites opacas, que batallas contra os garabanzos medrando disformes na auga, que absurda tarefa escoller lentellas de arroz, que impotencia cando o leite fervido vai por fora inevitablemente. E se o batifondo das tisolas non che deixaba oír a música, se o teu francés e alemán eran inútiles contra a grasa nos fogóns, se os tubos de auga berran como nenos ou gaivotas e as patacas se pegan no fondo da tarteira, nai, como que estás sorrindo nas fotos. And from the same book, baixo as uñas. A noite antes de morreres, ordes do médico, cun algodonciño mollado en acetona, borrei da uña do teu dedo pequeno o esmalte rosa. O ano antes de morreres, eu tiña 25. Estaba tan ocupada en non ser como a ti, non criar 7 fillos. borrar los esmaltes de todas as uñas, escapar os vincallos que tenden as cuncas de café. A noite antes, o esmalte no algodón, que o médico puidese ver o devalar do sangue por baixo das uñas, das caracolas brancas, última mare baleirándose no corazón. Mentres, a morte atuñaba pola cana dos osos. O ano antes, un amante que non coñecías, de coñecelo habías desgustarte. Atendía o balbordo que me zoaba dentro dos caracoles. Pintoume na uña do dedo pequeno con rotulador negro un corazón. Daquela non sabía que o teu sangue cayó nesa terra que teño baixo as uñas, que a ti debía as púas que aromaban, que tamén levo por baixo das uñas restos da tua tinta, que acabaría usurpando o teu nome. Non sabía que fuches ti que me educou contra ti mesma. And the next poem, o diario, is part of the impulse to write this book, because it was a small book that my mother, and at that time, the diary, at that time, mothers sometimes would write for their children, but adopting the first person. So she was writing this until I was 8, and this is the last entry that is in italics. E teño bastante mal xenio. Aquí acaba o diario. Acertaches, poñendo o punto despois da contundente descripción. É rabuda como a min, puideches escribir. Non acepta, sen protestar, que o luns siga o domingo. Ni negociaría como Brancaneves unha coubo ao prezo de cociñar, lavar, coser e calcetar. É impaciente en máis. Usas palabras para cortar, tesoiras mal afiadas. Do espello copia o meu desdén. Non ten boa relación coas esquinas dos mobles que lle meten cambadelas e deixan marcas negras dos seus beliscos. Herdou de min os osos pequenos. A mauva, a lingua gallada, a tinta o veleno que lle brota baixo as uñas ven de moi atrás. E aínda que se negue a recoñecelo, fun eu quen lle aprendeu a enfiar palabras. And from this same volume, O labirinto do bambú. Desconfía do labirinto de bambú. Bambú labirinto. Desconfía do labirinto de bambú. Oxe cana lanzado, mañá barrote, da súa multitude de espeques. Then, from another volume that is related to a house that has been inhabited by the last 5 centuries, as happened in Galicia, but now for the first time, nobody is living there, only people on the weekends. Barrer as cinzas. No lar morrerá o lume prendido hai 4 séculos, e non vou recoller o tizón caído da tua man, pai. A noite barrerei as cinzas, aínda que escorrente as ánimas dos antepasados, esgazando deles callóns de lembranzas. Se a cheminea cala as súas palabras de fume, gritando en silencio a soidade da casa, non me tome la requesta, porque a min, de 5 irmáns, os rachóns non llar agromarán novas raíces, volverán termar da terra sen ninguén que os queime. Na cociña, que o lume non quece, aínda bate o eco da tua voz, lendo libro tras libro, plantando en nós semente de vento. And from the same volume, and again about a house that where nobody is living and nobody is gathering the apples. As mazás reprochan desde a erva. 12 podremia de cadáveres de mazás esmagadas, rubia carne de feridos nunha guerra fora da horta, reventadas pola espoleta da ausencia. Unha mazá rompe desde dentro, así esguizan os cerebros. Tanto ten que garden baixo a tona, sabedoría o pecado. Na horta non quedan cobras, e ni sequera as abellas foron avisadas cando comprían. Caeron as mazás porque o seu tempo era pasado. Desde a herba berran os seus reproches. Now from Shiftings is a rewriting of Ovid Metamorphoses, but taking the women's voice in the kitchen territory, territorio da cocina. And it has a verse from Ovid. Parte chimpan en fondos caldeiros, parte estrala nos espetos, o cuarto pinga sangue, diz Ovid. A cociña foi decretada o teu territorio para que nela gobernases a xeometría das patacas, o aliñamento das tixolas, o estricto calibre da fariña. Ninguén disputa a progne o adubo dos anacos de seu fillo antes de espetalo no asadeiro. Para uns, vinganza contra Tereo. Para outros, signo de hospitalidade. Entón, contra quen toma a requesta? Se tes as mans anoadas nos panos de mesa. Os cortes nos teus dedos son testemunhas de amor. A cebola é nada máis a causa das bagullas. Ti mesma levantaches espeques con garzos. Cando amorosamente piques en anaquiños os dedos, as orellas, rustríndoos con prixel eurego. Cando mestures o sangue no amorado das filloas, non deixes de situar no medio da fonte os delicados peitos, de adubar o sexo con especias, o teu xeito. A cociña é o teu territorio, o teu reino. And from the same volume, Circe to Odysseus, from Ovid. Comecei a inzarme de sedas e a non poder falar, a emitir en troques de fala un rouco murmurio. Endureceuse a miña boca, converténdose en corvo fouciño. Son eu, a sabedora, a que escoita a voz do abruñeiro, a que doma a ortiga e escancia o zume da datura, a que debulla as augas das nubes e racha o ventre do nordés co fouciño de lata. Son eu, a destemida, a que se adianta as propostas dos homes, a da cama aberta que guía os formigos polas túas costas, navegando entre velas de sabas. Nada puxen nos teus mariñeiros que non estivesen neles. Fixen nos bedoiros, contemplaron o porco que levaban dentro, gruñiron con voz verdadeira, pozaron na terra, seguindo a súa inclinación. E cando desertes o meu leito e marches xalundes, fachendear das túas conquistas, das túas raposadas, procurarás en van desfacer a marca invisível da miña lingua na túa pé. And also from this volume, Comedores de Cabezas, and this is truly because more difficult for me than to learn Galician was to learn to eat the head of the fishes that like Chinese people, Galician people eat. O comer cabezas de peixe, recoñecémonos entre nosotros por fillos das náiades. Nas veas levamos salitre, usámolo ás veces para fabricar pólvora. E dos bultos a carón das orellas, nos días de temporal, nada digas, son garlas. O comungar coas cabezas do peixe, reclamamos a herdanza das espiñas, facémolas nosas gorxa abaixo, ve arriba, atravesando no seu eixe sutil palabras dun poema. Houve un tempo en que comíamos peixe cru e respirábamos na auga. Compartíamos simetría pentámera con ourizos e estrelas. nadávamos máis veloces que as luras. Agora, para cruzar a auga, debemos confiarnos no nordés, nas velas. And because I don't know about time, I'm going to read 2 more poems.
That's perfect, Marilar.
That are
Perfect. 2 more, yeah.
2 more that are unpublished. So, so please, if you go to, I don't always read poems. I will skip Babel. Later, if we have time, we can read it. And next, okay, that one in English. And says Olvido García Valdés is a great Spanish poet. El poema, como el paisaje, no, is that one. The ripping one before that one, Sudeep. The English is I don't always, that one. So this is Olvido. El poema, como el paisaje, es lugar donde se nos permite hablar con los muertos. This is Olvido García Valdés. Escribir a procura dos poemas que rachabas, como auga brollando na area. Tal vez florezan sombras entre as liñas, como auga, ou no reverso do papel usado no forro dos libros. Era morte a palabra. Decote advertías, e morrer pronto, poboando de medos a noite. Escribindo no reverso, ás veces, pestanexa unha sombra, ou reflexos esquivos na distancia sobre o mar. Din que teño as túas mans, se non as miro, se as deixo escribir soas, tal vez, con pastilla de tinta chinesa do mercado de Suchu, trazo caracteres incomprensíveis, ou non haber ninguén, case ninguén a quen non mentir. Ao final, sen saber por que os rachabas, onde os fragmentos, sen saber. And then I will skip Nettel and so go to Fora do Casulo, Out of the Cocoon. This is for a collective, in English. Fora do Casulo. Esgazalo Casulo ten os seus riscos. O ano 1976. Nel ía grabado o destino inexorable. Nai. Os criterios para ser muller completa, marcas a lume na pel. No proceso de metamorfose as entrañas disólvense nunha marfallada de células, fluidos, hormonas. O resultado é incerto. Unha muller, sen máis adxectivos. Unha muller definida en por sí. Fora do casulo, todo é incerteza. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Marilar. I mean, what always strikes me about your work is the ferocity of the imagery. None of this kind of scented linen cupboard for you. I mean, you know, I love the notion of the apples, you know, burst by the fuse of absence, that kind of sense of, well, and all the Ovidian transformations. One doesn't have to be an analyst to know that in intimate relationships, the violence starts in intimate relationships. But my goodness, you really track it for us. It's just wonderful stuff. Sudeep, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think the one poem, at least I was marking out bits I like, and there were so many actually, but the one that encapsulates, Marilar, your sense of community documenting of history, your personal documenting of history, your politics, is this bit where you say, my forked tongue, the ink or poison that flows from her fingernails comes from way back. And even if she won't admit it, It was I who taught her how to string words. Just simply brilliant how you sort of, compact it and make it so powerful in a sense. And it all comes back to the whole idea of the politics of words itself, in a sense. So yes, thank you. That was wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. The thing is that many women in my generation had a very fraught relationship with their mothers. And my mother died when I was really young. I was 25. So in fact, it was afterwards that I was able to reflect on on how a young woman marrying at 19, bringing 7 children, how in a way in this volume she is presented as Snow White, but after, what happens to Snow White afterwards?
Mm. Yes. I wonder how many women writers don't have mothers or who have problematic mothers. I wonder whether there's a kind of, we all know about the anxiety of influence in the male succession, the Oedipal struggle. I wonder how much that applies for women.
No, but apparently, I think that many of us in Spain and everywhere have a good affective, emotional relation with the mother. But then there is a tension, because, for instance, at that time in Spain, it was not possible to go to bed with your boyfriend. And then there was the politics and all these things. And it's only after a time that you realize that it was, I am what she did. I mean, she brought me up against herself, probably. But it was too late. I couldn't tell her because she has been dead for many years. But usually more poems about mothers are more on the side very affective, positive. So I think that we have also to acknowledge the other part.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you so much, Marilar. I have so much I could say, and I'm going to shut up and hand over to Sudeep and Sean. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marilar. A final poet is Sean O'Brien. I've just put up the long bio on the side, on the chat box. Sean, it's a real pleasure to see you finally. We haven't met in person. I've met you many, many times on the page, not just in your book of poems, but in your anthologies. And one of the things I really admire about you is that you equally balance your poetic side and your side as a critic. I think that's such an important sort of bipolar thing that not too many poets have. So that's a real source of pleasure and also information when you're watching British poetry and Irish poetry from far away. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Let me read out the formal bio, slightly shortened version. Sean O'Brien's 10th collection of poems, it says here, was published by Picador in 2020. His collected poems appeared in 2012. His work has received awards, including the T.S. Eliot and Forward Prizes, the Somerset Maugham, Cholmondeley, and E.M. Forster Awards, and the Roehampton Poetry Prize, as well as the Novi Sad International Writers Award and the European Lyric Atlas Award. His work has been translated into languages including Chinese, Dutch, Serbo-Croat, and Spanish. His novel, Once Again Assembled Here, was published in 2016, and his collection of short stories, Hortier Perdu, in 2018. He's also the translator of works including The Birds, Inferno, Spanish Golden Age plays, and others. In 2017, he was the Weidenfeld Professor of Comparative Literature comparative European literature at St. Anne's College in Oxford. He's currently Professor of Creative Writing at Newcastle University and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He lives in Newcastle upon Tyne, I think the home of Blood Axe Books. And welcome, Sean. There are lots of admirers sitting up at 10:30 in India waiting to listen to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's wonderful to be taking part in this imaginative enterprise, and I commend it in its the largeness of its imaginative undertaking. I shall read 7 poems, the last of which is tiny and about 2 lines long. The first poem is called It Says Here, and is the title poem of my most recent book. It's a poem about the way in which childhood reading shapes your understanding and comes to be relied on, I guess, when things grow more difficult. But it's also about the life of the imagination, which is something I'm interested in for its own sake. It says here that the way through the woods runs out in a blizzard, that the ocean does not, is eternal, and still for a while you may cross the great ice dome by dog sled, though at your own risk. That the book you are reading is one of a kind, that its door opens inwards and cannot be closed, that the train going over a bridge at night has somewhere to get to, that even the driver, heroic and faceless and bathed in the heat from the firebox, never discovers, that the sky is a page where, with a flourish, the birds write the truth in invisible ink, and the eye is too slow to be certain that this word and that word are never to meet, or the poem will sicken and die. That when you glance up from your reading, the rivers divide and divide, till at last you step down at a halt in the woods with its name painted over, and there in the evening the bride and the gamekeeper wait with their faces averted, wait for the signal to shift and the lamp to glow red and a train to arrive, but not yet and not yet. That though this is August, the snow is beginning. You blink and the woods are half buried and the traveler's gone. And as for the fire and the rose that it now seems you set out in search of, that is a different story, or so it says here.
Wonderful.
The middle section of my recent book, it says here, is taken up with a long poem of about 900 lines called Hammersmith, which, if I try and describe it very briefly, is a kind of dream vision of England during and since the Second World War, focused through the West London borough of Hammersmith next to the River Thames, where my parents met. And it's, well, it's all kinds of things, but this is the last canto, which doesn't take place in the original setting of Hammersmith, but somewhere else entirely. But at the end, there is a return to the river. And I think I would have to admit that this has something to do with the catastrophe my countrymen have recently visited on themselves for no reason that anybody can establish. And I will say no more about it than that. Hammersmith, Canto 10. At the end of the garden runs a river I will never reach. They walk there in the silence of the intimate, and with the day so vast and patient they have nothing on the clock. I come indoors and light the fire and look up at the flickering leer on the face of Silenus carved over the mantle. The old are sent here from the future to ensure that we despair. Better never to have been, but failing that, stick to aesthetics, which in turn will stick to you like napalm to the skin. Thus Ryan. Deep beneath the hearth, a beam is smouldering, ignited by a memory that leaves the city mined with unexploded ordnance, sunk among the bones in flooded graves. Reading Captain January and Braddock by the fire, I am part still of the done war. The subsequent disaster could be years away. For now, the old weight-bearing beam consumes itself austerely by the splinter in a steady, tended rage, whose day will come and look like vindication, when the stack of stories falls into itself and through itself and down again and down through the final dark river to nowhere. For underneath this fury that will seek its own extinction in the wreck of all that stands and call it victory, there is no bedrock to be found. Imaginary England rises for a moment like a gas flare from a sewer and is gone. But for the idiots long drowned who thought their fear and rancor and a half share in a shotgun marked them for a war waged underground against whatever was to hand, now leave me with the house divided to await its immolation, to bear witness there, complicit by the fact of being born and drinking from the poisoned well. Let books and earth and oily water burn, likewise the living and the dead. But let me remember the possible days, the river where the garden ends, and those I lost are walking still. Ever since my teens, I've been very interested in the July plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944. That combination of the religious and the military and various others who couldn't quite organize themselves well enough to pull it off. But I'm fascinated by the climate of absolute horror that followed. And this is the shirt of Nessus, as you know, is poisoned and cannot be removed. The shirt of Nessus. He goes out through the kitchen seeing no one, to the woods of boyhood where he means to blow his brains out. This is in July. Among the trees they have anticipated his intention. He is relieved of his possessions, but will keep the shirt of Nessus. He writes letters to his wife and to his son in the inferno that approaches from the east. Then last his old professor, now retired, to a lake where he is watching barges dumping gold. The old man sends his manservant and housekeeper away with thanks and blessings. The prisoner sees this, sees all the failures of the slow conspiracy. Soon tanks will cross the Vistula. He must write his other testament on the insides of his eyelids, hoping that his eyes survive him when his body is unearthed inside the prison yard by those who come a day, an hour too late, but see smoke rising from the earth. It may be so. And then, one autumn day, he wakes inside a state he cannot name, of knowing every scratch upon the iron door and all the names from which the screams that rise all hours from the sweat-soaked underworld have been detached. It smells, he smells, of burning now. The shirt of Nessus swarms with self-consuming roses. Yes, he writes, although his hands resemble candle wax that drips to seal the page before his book is done, I think there is another place where we might live. Beyond the lime pits in the baking fields, train after train is passing through, ablaze and bound for nowhere. And yet, he adds, black roses coiling from his eyes, to wait among the rags of time, and to lament must be the only consolation. And on a more hopeful note, a brief love poem called Rubies. Rubies for Jerry. When I turn for home in the street's black river, fish by clay are frozen, rust and gold, a shoal of earrings over which the rowan berries blaze unfallen. If the street is endless, yet the ice is coming, how can both be true? At your dressing table, you were choosing earrings from the box beside the ring tree. Put back the reticent amethyst and let the far-off turquoise wait in the midsummer dark at Heraklion. Choose rubies now with drops of gold and wear them always.
Lovely.
We've tended, I think, probably with good reason, to avoid being, as theatre people say, too much on the nose about the pandemic. And it's interesting the way in which the subject insinuates itself into work that you might think was about something else. And I suspect this little poem, The Desks, has something of that in mind, though in a rather oblique, inexplicit way. The Desks. I dream of how, when we have gone, the city turns to introspection, seeking themes and patterns from innumerable instances. Where to begin? Why not the dank accommodation shadows reach beneath a railway arch, or better still, the stairs descending past the nearby offices of lawyers and comedians, deeper than the scope of public scrutiny? The sort of thing I'd choose if I existed, ending in a place, if that is what it is, where no attempt at decoration has been made, with one anachronistic admonition bolted to the wall concerning boiler ash, and next to that, a single door, too wide, too low, that opens on a chamber whose far end is not shown, at which innumerable desks and chairs are aimed, awaiting God knows what examination. And I'll read the very short poem now and then I want to finish. This is a version of a very famous old Irish poem that lots of people have taken turns with. And this little attempt on it is in memory of two great Irish poets lost in the last 10 years, Seamus Heaney and Kieran Carson, to whom, of course, must now be added the name of Derek Mahon. From the Irish. The blackbird at dawn, signing his name on the air with a golden nib. And finally, and thank you for listening, a poem called The Language. This probably isn't the place to start theorizing about one's own work. In fact, I'm not sure there is a place for that anywhere, but I think this is about the distinction between language and the world. My great friend Bill Herbert thinks it's about something else completely, but and rain is the central feature of the poem, because we've had nothing but rain for weeks on end really now, apart from the odd bit of snow. The language. Falling through the aspen grove and ushering itself along the gutters, night rain speaks a language you have never understood. Where is the glossary that could admit the drowning air and lustrous blackness, or the roaring? All this time, you have confused the subject with the method, when the thing done is the thing itself and not for keeping. The storm intensifies. The dark is light enough to see the slick rain shining on the slates like an effect designed by God, and yet no more designed than all the nothingness your training leads you to infer. Unsayable, sipping at the rims of manhole covers and revolving anti-clockwise down a drain pipe for a laugh. It runs off at the mouth, it drinks itself, and with its throat wide open swallows, tasting nothing, neither noun nor tense, insensibly particular, oracular yet empty, pouring from the dark into the dark, and still, for all his animated talk, indifferently bearing Orpheus' head away. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Wonderful, wonderful. Yes. Sean, I have many questions for you, but just a comment for the moment, and we'll get to the proper discussion later. I'm very keen to read the cantos, the Hammersmith cantos, of course, and a lot of English poets have written on railway lines. If you go back in history, there's so many of them. The poem is in tercets, and I was wondering what the sort of architecture alludes to, and long lines. I mean, not that long, but certainly the tercets interest me, and whether the other cantos are also in the same sort of structural pattern.
Well, I think the tercet, which has certainly become a staple in contemporary poetry in Britain in recent years, is in a sense like the long desired perpetual motion machine. It's never quite finished. It's always beginning. The matter is never quite settled. It keeps accumulating itself. It's not like a quatrain, for example, or a couplet, which implies a kind of finish. Whereas the tercet, at any rate, to my ear, to my way of hearing, is kind of open and flexible, and well, it seems to suit my purposes. That's why I use it, and it's also the influence of Dante, having translated the Inferno about 20 years ago. It's impossible not to be influenced by that compact, ever-moving verse that Dante produced.
Interesting that you said tercets are sort of open-ended and not finished. Sure, the couplet and the quatrain, you know, that's an even-numbered line, so there's a definite divisibility in terms of mathematical number. But
Yeah.
to me, the odd number lines have a difference. I mean, maybe coming from a tradition which is, you know, non-Western, where odd numbered lines that have a sense of completeness. And the reason I say that is because, say you have the two polarities, if you take the sort of the old physics example of a rod with a fulcrum in the middle, and the moment you use the fulcrum and change the fulcrum, the balance of the rod changes. So it always has to be triangulated in some sense, whether it's 3 or 9. And I'm going to get into this discussion with Arthur's poetry later on, because I see a lot of numerical patterning that is. But it's interesting how I read the tercets and how you as an English, Irish, UK poet sort of perceive the numbers. But
Yeah, well, I don't have a rigid view of it. This is a preference, an inclination. I'm not claiming that it suits some underlying cosmic pattern or anything of that description. It just suits my purposes in the construction of a poem.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you, Sean, for as ever being a kind of, I mean, a touchstone poet, but this time I really thought about you as, because you use the word witness comes up quite in, I think it's the second poem you read, that sense of inalienable kind of clear sight. You know, I think that sometimes people who read Sean O'Brien and listen to Sean O'Brien, you know, there's a question, is it poetry that's driven by the concrete? Is it poetry that's driven by philosophy, by thought? Because it does both so clearly simultaneously. I mean, like as it were the two rails of the railway line. But that, the inalienability of kind of clear sight, of integrity, is one of the things that I think I always return to in your work. And you obviously can't respond to a compliment on one level, but of course you can. So I wonder if you could say something about witness.
When I first got really interested in poetry, which is a long time ago now, about 55 years ago, when I was 14, I was very excited by the early work of the British poet Ted Hughes. And I realized when I tried to describe to myself what it was that thrilled me, it was the sense that his work left the world more real than it was when he found it, you know, that he gave an additional substance and texture to the things of the world and the climates and atmospheres of the world. And that's always been fundamental to me. And that's also somehow that goes along with an unquenchable interest in history and politics. And as we know, in British poetry, there's a traditional anxiety about when politics gets into the picture, that it's felt to be a kind of a dilution or a way of bringing impurities to bear on a noble art. I can't be doing with that. It's life, you know. So in all its forms, it has to be in the poems one way or another. And the beautiful doesn't really earn its keep without the crime going on next door, as far as I can see.
So it's high stakes reality, really.
Yes, yeah, perhaps, yeah.
I love the haiku also. I mean, that's obviously, apart from being a nod to Seamus and Kieran Carson, and now of course you've added Derek Mahon, is the logo of the journal that Kieran Carson used to edit, the yellow nib,
Yes,
and you make it into the golden nib.
Yeah.
And well, the reference to the journal, and the black bird, of course, is the logo. And of course, there are so many people who've written on it. It's just really cleverly done, you know, I thought.
I don't claim any originality for it, really. I mean, this one is moving at this, you know, at that micro level of the haiku. You're really moving some available parts around, you know, a bit like one of those old puzzles that we used to play with kids, where there was one less tile in the frame than there were spaces, and you were continually trying to move the tile into the place you couldn't reach. You know? So it's sort of, yeah.
I think it's very, I mean, again, just thinking as a listener, it's so rich, that sense of being incredibly cognizant of like the Irish tradition in both languages, but absolutely not being stuck within it. So, you know, so you have the head of Orpheus being swept away by the rainstorms or down the gutter and so on, and that fluency with and you know, and the Dante, you know, the Terza Rima and so on, and it just, it's quite complex, isn't it? That negotiation between kind of cultural loyalty or authenticity, those aren't quite the right words, deployment even, and not a kind of insularity and introspection. And you know, there's something there that's quite hard placing a particular diction, a particular poetics.
Well, I find that these interests just, they come up alongside you, you know. You know, you're just going along, and suddenly something turns up, and you find it's pertinent to what you're doing. So, you know, you gradually accumulate these things over a lifetime. I think I'm not really interested in nationalism, either politically or in a literary sense either. And I'm not very keen on limitations, you know, saying you can't do this because you're not X. You know, I had enough of that in my childhood. It wasn't, growing up in England in the 1960s was not particularly pleasant experience if you were from an Irish background. You had to put up a lot of crap from people telling you who you were and who you weren't. So I don't have any of that anymore. I don't do it.
Leanne, I think, wants to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Sean. It's great to hear you. And well, I'm so wonderful to join you, because I'm especially interested about this, because the topic to extremely important. I think also to the to our this world today, and it's so important. But Sean, when I listening to your poem, of course, my English is not so good, but one line was so touching me. You say that the river flowed nowhere in the poem, if I remember okay. But this was so interesting because just some times ago, wrote about our situation in China, actually, I almost had similar sentence, but totally opposite another direction. It's almost like the river flows from everywhere, but toward to us, you know. And so this situation of, well, poetically, but also politically, we are in certainly maybe find somewhere the history actually almost lost direction, or actually we never had any direction. We are actually in this situation, the point we don't know where we are going to, or stand still, or backwards, or actually if anything. So if you, of course, know, you've been China, you absolutely see the situation in Hong Kong, and all our friends, Fiona, Sean, others know all those friends, but they are extremely disappointed now in China. And so after all, it's, of course, we are continue like even last time. Maybe we are not time to give answer, but we firstly has to find the question. What is the question of the reality? Where is the reality? So Sean, could you tell me what you feel? Does the river has to flow to somewhere?
Well, it's a river in a poem, Leanne.
Yeah,
So you can do whatever's required of it. You know, the river you refer to flows from everywhere, and that sounds to me like an optimistic notion. You know, the kind of an omnifluvial.
Beautiful line. I love it. Yeah.
Whereas it happens that the river at this point in that poem is kind of stalled for various reasons. But I don't think poetic images should have the force of law, if you see what I mean. It's not definitely X or definitely Y. You know, it's just on this imaginative occasion, this is the way it seems.
Is poetry not the same as philosophy then? She said provocatively.
I don't know enough about philosophy to comment, really, Fiona. He said with relief.
I was just thinking that if the river is a concept, then actually it can become quite binding. You know, it steps out of language and becomes life world. Yes. You know, in Lian's sense, but
maybe after all, you know, if we cannot find any kind of a party or left or right, the wings which we find belong to or something, then we had to somehow come back to our own language to keep the full life of the language in the creative form of poetry or something. At least we find a stand of the individuality or our own individual point of view. I don't know, but this is such strange time.
I'm sure other people have lots of interesting things to say about this, but poetry is something that happens, you know, that people write, and it's significant to those who are interested in it, and doesn't mean much to those who aren't. And over time, I've grown a bit suspicious of claims about the significance of poetry. It's very significant to me, and I imagine to everybody who's, you know, taking part in this at the moment, it's pretty important too. But we have to bear in mind that it's as vulnerable as anything else, you know, to the depredations of time and power and so on. But that's what gives it, in a sense, its thrill. It's not immune, you know, poetry is not immune to history.
I wonder, yeah, exactly. Marilar and Arthur.
No, for me, because I write poetry and fiction, there is a big difference, because when I'm writing fiction, I'm thinking of the reader. And when I'm writing poetry, I think only of about myself. So in fact, I remember when I published the first volume, I thought nobody's going to understand it. is a feeling that perhaps other people have. So you are looking inside. And of course, because we are writing from a place and from a body, and so it is situated, but I cannot. I don't expect poetry to mean more like in political terms. Also, as Fiona says at the beginning, everything is political in a sense. But so I think it's a good thing to be inside a river, even if they are so small as Santiago rivers.
I would just add that, I mean, one of the poets whose greatest work most interests me is Andrew Marvell, who's an extremely shifty, shady, hard to track down character. We don't know very much about him. We have no very clear sense of his opinions about anything. But this makes his political work, such as his famous Horatian ode on Cromwell's return from Ireland, one of the major political points in the language, so kind of completely ambiguous that it's almost as if history is taking shape in front of you and then changing its mind. And the dramatic elements of poetry, the sense of the poem as event, I think I would add, is very important to me. Sometimes the kind of marmoreal statement just lays something down, but a lot of the time it's a sense of something taking place, And this is also true in his love poems as well, or in a philosophical poem like The Garden. Everything invites at the same time as it resists interpretation.
So language is a thing in the world, and poetry is a thing in the world.
Yes.
I wonder if I could ask Arthur if he wanted to say anything in this very interesting conversation.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add, but I'm more like seconding, I think, a lot of the comments that have been said. I also am thinking of poetry as, global, as we're all on one planet, and not as nationalist movements. And, like it or not, the threats we face are everywhere and simultaneous. And I do think we, as poets, have a special commitment to language. And I like may have been Sean who talked about the fragility of language, because, language is, at least certainly in the United States, been so under attack over the last number of years that to be writing a poem, just to write a poem, is a political statement in itself. And I think, obviously, we're passionate about poetry, and whoever, poems reach, they reach, and that's great. I think historically, of course, you were talking about translating Dante, who threw the popes into hell, which I've never been able to forget that. The first time I read the Inferno, I thought, wow, that takes courage. That is really putting your life on the line there. And certainly if you think of Yeats, many of his greatest poems have concern with politics, or in a way it helped root his poetry. It seems to me his early poems are much more sort of romantic, ethereal, and then the sort of, foul rag and bone chop of the heart. I think in American poetry, interestingly, when I was coming of age in the 70s, it was, there was almost like an unspoken stricture, don't make a poem political, because if you do that, you're sort of distorting the poem, or you're overlaying, or you're, making, borderline propaganda. But I think over time that has changed and evolved. And ultimately, I think poetry is about freedom. I think writing a poem is about, writing from one's deepest self, and resisting any form or all forms of coercion. If someone says, well, don't do this or don't do that, the poem, one of the things I love about poetry is discovering where the poem is going to take me, and oftentimes shedding the idea of where I think the poem wants to be about, or whatever. I discover those were just like shells or whatever that I have to sort of strip off and let the poem really take me somewhere unforeseen. And that sense of discovery has to do with spontaneity and freedom.
Arthur, don't you think, I mean, you mentioned Yeats, and I was kind of curious because when you see Yeats's poetry over time, there's a certain point he, obviously he was very influenced by the occult and those poems, which was a significant number of poems which were written around that phase, often I find were the critics wrote about it in a kind of a fuzzy kind of way, not knowing what the occult really was. And I think some of his best poetry and the most complicatedly constructed poetry he wrote was during the time when he was sort of certainly interested in that. And I want actually to lead you to, because I think I want to come back to your poetry, because it's about the three of you really, is the importance of architecture and mathematical and geometrical patterns, both not only visually, but also at a conceptual level. Of course, you allude to I Ching and the Confucian idea of, the book of divination and so on. But tell us more specifically about the entire concept of hexagrams and trigrams, because that is fascinating. Because, the multiples of those numbers also become larger lotus-like flowers, 64, for instance.
So the I Ching, the ancient book of divination, I sometimes do like I do translation when I'm trying to think about what can I do next. I know what I've done, I want to try something I haven't done before. And in a way, the I Ching is not running from responsibility. I see it as through the yarrow process or the coin method, which is more quick, but they both involve chance, of using the I Ching as an ancient text to sort of mirror back, but not just mirror, but also to be a window to sort of see through or see out of or beyond. And in that sense, become a transformer. The very first time I used the I Ching was actually, I remember very clearly in 1995 when a friend of mine called me and said the mystical poet Gu Chung had killed his wife and hanged himself in New Zealand. And I had met Gu Chung in Beijing in 1985, and I was just stunned. And I sort of didn't know what to do with that news. And I thought, okay, and it was the first time in my life I threw the coins to see what the I Ching, the Oracle book, would respond to. And when I looked up the pattern of the 6 lines, it was before completion. And I remember reading the commentary thinking about here's somebody who dies before they complete their work. And as I looked at the 6 lines, some were solid and some are broken. There isn't time to go into the whole process of divination, but I thought of sort of solid parts and broken parts and how they create a kind of tension with each other. So the very first poem I wrote using the I Ching as a kind of structural underpinning was this poem called Before Completion. And then over time, I've used it just as a way to sort of shake things up. If I notice I'm writing a lot of poems in couplets, I think, okay, I want to break it up, or I want a kind of rigor. You mentioned the word architecture in language. And I'm not formal in the sense of wanting to write, say, a sonnet, a sestina, or a villanelle, but I'm still very interested in the kind of rhythm and pulse of a poem and the phrasing and the use of repetition as a way of layering or creating like a weaver, certain threads or patterns that come back again and again. So in shaping language, to me, there's that sort of tension between spontaneity, that sense of wanting to break free or run loose, and also that sense that there needs to be some kind of rigor shaping the language. And that's often discovered rather than like superimposing, okay, I'm going to write a sonnet and here it is. It's more like thinking about, oh, here are certain patterns of language. Like when I was writing sightlines, I started to see repeating words. And I thought, oh, well, what if I give myself the stricture and just play with that, where each line picks up a word or word from the previous lines? It creates a kind of architecture. And if the last line leads back into the title, then there's a kind of circle. So there's an unconventional form of, it's sort of like dismantling and reassembling closure, things like that. So I'm fascinated by patterns with language, and I don't know, maybe that hope that helps.
But also the use of one of the very important aspect of your work is the use of white space, which not that many poets can use it proactively. Perhaps you can talk about that a little bit.
Well, I want kind of like a yin yang symbol. I want the empty space to charge the language that's there. And I think too often a poem can just sort of run on and pile up images. And actually, one of the things I want poetry to do is to actually slow down and enact the process, or give the reader time to really weigh the language and not just feel like, oh, well, there it went, I'm going to reread it, but to actually have that space and let the images register, or the emotion that's coming through. And that sense of dance with language is really important to me, because ultimately it's about intensity, focus, concentration, and also that sense when the word is there. Fiona was talking about how there's a lot behind my poems. I see it like almost like Zen stones in a garden where the rock pushes up above the surface, and those are the words, but below there's a lot you can't see, but you can intuit and you can feel from the language that you're experiencing as a reader, there's a lot more behind it, and that is moving the language into its shape. So that white space is really important. If you took a Zen garden and you just stuck a whole bunch of stones around it, it doesn't look that interesting. But if you, as in Ryoanji, put them in clusters and discover as you walk back and forth, you can never see all the stones at one time, that there are 15 stones and they're positioned in different angles, so that as you enter, you can see 12, and at the center 11, and at the far end 14. You're experiencing this space in the way that one is reading a poem, one is entering a kind of architectural space or experience.
Yeah, that's what yes, absolutely. That sense that your poems show us that understanding is something spatial, and it's not just spatial in a sense of the material world is spatial, but that they show us the kind of spatiality of concept and understanding, and the process of understanding. It's very interesting because actually all three of you poets have such different kind of spatio-temporal metabolisms, don't you? I mean, inordinately different, really striking, almost like, how do we listen to three different kinds of poetry in an afternoon, evening, morning, whenever it is?
Well, may I ask one question to Arthur?
Yes, and then Marilar. So Leanne and then Marilar.
One short things, because Arthur has this very interesting background, because the deeper background with the Chinese back, but also very contemporary American poet. But so recently, did you feel any kind of energy, but from the difficult situation in China, but could be transformed into the creative energy in your poem?
I think so. I mean, I think there's so much tension happening in Hong Kong, in China, in Taiwan. I think the important thing is to not be in a hurry, to sort of, I think it was Rilke who said, it's all about gestation and bringing forth. I think the important thing is to give it time to, I personally am sort of thinking about dissonance and how to use some of that tension in language. But again, I don't want to rush it.
Yeah.
Okay. Marilar, you were going to say something.
Well, I was going to say that I agree completely that, in poetry you create a space. Well, in my case, my volumes are very compact. So it's difficult to understand perhaps 3 poems from a book because there is a lot of recurrence. So like what Arthur said, that you take a words or a metaphor, and then it runs across the whole collection. So, like for instance, you were talking, Fiona, about the spikes and all this, but it's because one of the metaphors is about the hedgehog. It's a Grimm's tale about the boy that was a hedgehog, and is part of the metaphors. So there are a lot of animals in this collection that you see feeding into each other. But all my books have 33 poems. Sometimes this I am cheating, because if they are longer, I make 3 together or 4 in a single, because the first one had 11, 11, 11, and I don't like even numbers. So after that, and is imposed that, I don't know. I mean, it truly is something that is outside, that you can break it, this law. But the thing is that in Galician, as in Spanish, there is lines are much longer than in English. You can realize that looking at the translation, because verbs and a lot of I don't know, prepositions. So anything that you will write that explains, for instance, that are very in Spanish and in Galician there is the 11th rhythm that I think that in English I see much shorter.
It was
lines.
noticeable during your reading, actually, watching reading the English on screen and listening to you. It was quite noticeable that, you know, words that one could recognize from their Latin root. It took quite a long time for the Galician to get to them, whereas the English got that. Yeah.
Sometimes I say, oh, I wish I could write in English, and it would be much more easy, because you know, Galician has this complicated thing, and also, so going back to the space, well, the space is populated by a lot of metaphors and imagery that sometimes is very private, or you think is private, then you discover that other people have similar feelings, but also is quite local. Like, for instance, now we are in the middle of carnival that is suspended, Galician carnival that is very long, and at this time people is eating blood pancakes. So our pancakes, when you mix in the butter, you mix blood. So of course that when that comes into a poem, well, people knows about this if they are here, but otherwise perhaps it's not easy to.
When you put the note, and I thought the note looked very innocent compared to the violence of the poem. So yes, it's very. So it's a cultural space. It's a
cultural space, and also another issue that is like my second volume, The Lion Spring. In Galicia, in this generation now, in these last 10 or 20 years, it's very common that houses that have been, when there have been people living for centuries, nobody is living there. Why? Well, cultural changes and all this, because this is a land like Ireland of immigrants. Nobody was coming in, too poor, you know. So this is a trope that people will recognize if you are talking of a house that is crumbling, or if you are talking of where the worms are eating the wood, and all this is real. I mean, it's not a metaphor. I've seen this in the house. So is something that, well, as Arthur said, everything is political. So if you write a poem or a volume about a house where nobody is living, is for Galician people, it means also why people have to emigrate, why these houses, you know, why they're rural, nobody can live in the villages. and all this has different meanings, not only the strict familial meaning of well, people that are mourning their father.
Yeah,
Thank you
that's
so
lovely.
much.
Yes,
Sudeep.
thank you. Yeah, we are sort of coming towards the close of our program. So, but I have an important question, because many of us certainly are, apart from being poets, also critics, editors, and anthology makers. And I remember a long time ago, I picked up this anthology Firebox way back. You know, it's now seems dated, but it's an important document of the time. And also I see Silk Dragon. And of course, there's Leanne's Jade Ladder, which was also very significant. So the question to all of you is, when you're making an anthology, is it important for you to be inclusive? By which I don't mean that you have to cut the quality down just to include various people. Is inclusivity an important aspect of anthology making? Because anthologies like these come about very, very rarely, and they stay much longer than, say, an individual book of poems in a kind of a larger sense, in the sense of university or schools and so on. So I'm just curious, because when I reread Firebox before this program, and it says in a poetry from UK, well, England and Britain and Ireland after 1945. And there's so much Black Lives Matter and Black Poets Matter and all that stuff happening. And I was saying, okay, let me go back and count the number of Black poets in the book. And there are like 4 or 5 of them. There are absolutely no Asians or otherwise. I was just curious, because when I was looking at the time frame, there are lots of British Asian poets or British Chinese poets or British many other poets, apart from, of course, Afro-Caribbean poets who were also significant at the time. I was wondering what made you not include or include them vis-a-vis that particular one, and then we can talk about the others later.
23 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess I didn't like the work.
Right.
Can I just jump in and say, actually, the poetic culture was very different from British culture as a whole. It actually was, poetry was just a much whiter activity than it is now. I mean, I don't think that Sean's anthology then was unrepresentative. I mean, of course, the proportion would be unrepresentative now, because the who's doing what and who's doing wonderful stuff has changed enormously. But 23 years ago, that wasn't the case. I mean, writers came, Black and BAME writers came much later into British poetry than they did into British fiction, for example. We had this wonderful, you know, eruption of Indian and African Englishes, for example, into British prose, into British fiction. It took a lot longer for that same thing to happen in British poetry. Just wanted to say that as a witness.
Yeah, no. I mean, I see that, but I think the honest answer was good, because honesty doesn't come across very often.
Just as a
Yeah, I'm
side
being honest too, though.
No, in the sense that I didn't like it. Well, if you're the editor and if you didn't like it, that's the fairest answer you can give. Yes.
Yeah, I'd also point out that at the time, because the book drew quite a lot of attention, most of it unfavorable, as is always the case with anthologies, you know, because everybody would have done a better job than the person who actually did it. The Welsh were extremely pissed off, because, you know, they felt underrepresented. And I was supposed to go on the Radio 4 Today program, the big current affairs morning radio program, to defend myself against the infuriated Welsh, but fortunately it was cancelled because some big political story came up instead. Of course, the condition of Welsh poetry is, to Welsh poets, a big political story in itself. I wouldn't, if I were doing it now, I would do something, it would be rather different, obviously. Yeah, obviously. And there are people I wish I'd put in that I didn't at the time. And there are others who probably who proved not to be up to it, but that's the way with anthologies. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but there isn't the time.
Yeah.
Only about anthologies in my country. If you were looking at anthologies until 1990, it would be very difficult to find women in anthologies. So there were anthologies supposedly about poetry in the 80s and 90s with one woman. So I think now this has been changing. It's not that there were no women poets before, it's just that the gays.
Yeah, well, the most influential anthology of the 1960s in Britain was the New Poetry,
New
edited
Poetry.
by Alvarez. And I think that featured one woman poet, no, two women poets. There was Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. Yeah, I also suspect that you can't really do these things on a kind of on a basis of proportionality. You edit the book as you see it, or you don't bother doing the book at all.
No, I am not talking about proportionality, but I think at least here is exactly the reverse. Is that the people preparing the anthology that were men, they were not seeing women.
No.
So I'm not claiming there should be, half and
I'm in
half.
sympathy with the point you were making there. I agree about that entirely. It's just, you go and look at Rita Dove's Penguin Anthology of American Poetry, and some very significant poets are completely left out of it, or radically underrepresented. But that's Rita Dove's view of it. She's the editor, so it's up to her. You can't please everybody. In fact, in the case of editing anthologies, you can actually please absolutely nobody, because everybody knows better.
And everybody you've left behind becomes permanent enemies, of course.
No.
Some of them. Yes.
It's not friends yet.
I wouldn't say that editing anything is particularly grateful process.
Well, you don't
edit magazines and end up, with quite a lot of fury.
Yeah. We don't want to get into kind of miseries of poetry biz, but you wonder sometimes what people think they're doing in the world when they start attacking books when they haven't actually gone to the trouble of doing anything about it themselves.
That's right. Yes. So,
well, exactly.
Yes.
On the other hand, poetry itself is wonderful, and we've had a wonderful afternoon evening of poetry. Sorry, Sudeep, you were going to say exactly the same, weren't you?
Pretty much, yes. I think just the fact that people here are doing it, consciously, that's what matters really at the end. Good poetry stays and it binds us. And this enterprise, Fiona and I, one of the pleasures is just building bridges. Is such a cliche, but it is, and in this kind of time, and sometimes I feel that we are reaching more people doing online poetry seminars now, reading now, than you would otherwise. 20 people, 30 people, if it's a regular reading, unless it's a big reading. So thank you so much. And the poetry was stellar. It was fantastic. It was beautifully read, and I think it was such a treat. And fortunately, because we are in the digital age, it'll all be archived on the YouTube channel. So once it's uploaded, maybe in a day or two, Dawn is going to send us the final version. Feel free to share it with other people, students and others as well. So from my end, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, huge thanks to Arthur, to Marilar, to Sean, and to Dawn for driving, and to all of you for attending. I mean, what a wonderful afternoon. What a privilege to be part of it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
No.